Hey everybody, I'm Joe,
And I'm John.
and we are here to teach you about swamps and about bogs. And to be frank, when I first heard that we're going to speak about bogs, I did not know what a bog was. I mean, not really. We've heard of it, might have a picture, but didn't know what it really was. So we figured we'd go ask some other people, see what they thought.
So, we're going to go out and ask, what is a bog?
What is a bog? What is a bog?
A bog?
A bog, B-O-G, a bog.
B-O-G. Honestly,
You're not sure? What is a bog?
Bog?
That's right.
I don't know. I've never heard of a
No.
bog before.
Never heard of it, no idea. What do you think a bog is?
Bog?
A bog, B-O-G.
It's like a swamp?
Swamp?
Sure.
Anything else?
I don't know. That's a pretty good way to describe it.
Okay, basically like a swamp.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is a bog?
it's an animal,
Animal? Okay. Do you know what kind of animal?
bird,
Bird?
What is a bog?
what is what?
A bog?
A bog?
Yeah, B-O-G.
Oh, a bog.
Yeah.
I will think of it as like a marshy area with, dead and rotten wood and stuff like that. Yeah.
What is a bog?
A what?
A bog.
A bog?
Yeah.
This is so much. This is all you do.
So, I think it's a low-lying area that's mushy or like swampy, real wet soil.
I'm sad alone in a boggy marsh, totally motionless except for her heart. Mud flowed up into Lump's pajamas. She totally confused all the passing piranhas. She's Lump, she's in my head.
Okay, so we've been talking about what is a bog. We've been asking other people, what is a bog, and looking at their responses, and they're not always awesome. But I guess now we need to actually say what a bog is. A bog, in a lot of ways, based on this picture here, is like a swamp, except one of the big differences is the acidity of the water. It's very acidic, and the reason it's so acidic is because sphagnum moss is this substance that's constantly leaking protons, hydrogen ions, right? So that increases the general acidity of the environment. And this increase in acidity has a lot of implications for the biotic factors of a bog, namely the flora and the fauna. So we see interesting things like carnivorous plants, or we see animals with sort of strange adaptations and acidophilic bacteria. And something else we want to look at is fungi as well. I mean, how do fungi work in relation to these bogs? They work as decomposers, and the general idea of a bog is it's not a very hospitable environment to normal biotic life like maybe you or I. So down here is a little foot that's sticking out, and that's the foot of a corpse. And there's actually a big study on corpses inside bogs. In 1984, there was one discovered, and his name was Pete Marsh, was kind of like the joke name given to him, but he was like a 4,000-year-old corpse that was extremely well preserved, and it had to do with an influx of tannic acid inside bogs that comes from the way the soil interacts with peat and with sphagnum moss. And sphagnum moss is a component of peat, and peat is one of the big things we're going to talk about later as far as why bogs are being utilized by humans and how they're being utilized. So I'm going to get into now how bogs are formed, because the process is pretty interesting. And I've got a little demo for that. So when bogs are formed, it starts off with glaciers melting. Okay, so this Tupperware container is going to represent just a landscape. Okay, within this landscape, we have a melted glacier represented by my water here. And then after this water forms, plant life grows, plant life dies, decays, sediments form, and a process called terrestrialization. And that's going to be represented by these pugs of clay here. So they're going to kind of run around the outskirts and form a bit of a landmass. Okay, so right now we kind of have this weird kind of damp environment that has a little bit of solid mass in it. And then this sponge is going to represent sphagnum moss, that we were talking about before, which is one of the big characteristics of a bog. So obviously this happens over time, but if we represent sphagnum moss growing in quickly, it makes just this strange, kind of weird, wet environment, and that's kind of how we can think of a bog forming, and those steps of polutification, which is the sphagnum moss growing in, terrestrialization, which is the formation of clay, and melting glaciers all together. So now that you've got a better idea of how bogs form, we're going to take a look at where they form geographically. So typically they will form in temperate areas, and they tend to have cooler climates, okay? And it kind of depends what kind of bog you're talking about. There are northern bogs, which obviously exist more in the northern regions, but bogs generally, as a rule, tend to exist in the northern hemisphere. We don't really see them down here in the south. So our cooler climates that are temperate, we can see some in the United States, in the northern United States. There's actually, I believe, one in Kent, Ohio. And if we come over here, they're a big deal in Ireland, the UK, and there's a lot of emphasis on European conservation of bogs because it's kind of a heritage thing. And then all throughout Russia, there seems to be a lot of bogs as well. So that's sort of where we can see them distributed over the globe.
Love lingered last in line for brains, and the one she got was sort of rotten and insane. Small things so sad that birds could land. Is love fast asleep or rocking out with the...
And today I'm going to talk to you about swamps. And I know what you're thinking. Swamps are those nasty, wet, smelly places that are filled with hillbillies that wrestle alligators and swamp monsters like Shrek. But no, they're actually really beautiful ecosystems. They're crucial for not only the biota that live there, but also for us as human beings. So swamps are distinguished from other wetlands by the type of vegetation that inhabits them. So swamps are going to be inhabited by woody shrubs and trees. Another distinguishing factor about swamps is that they have high nutrient availability. This is because when they're at the base of rivers, they're often a sink for nutrient runoff. And the plants in the swamps use this nitrogen and phosphorus, in growing, and that's what creates these big trees. Anything that's not used is often trapped in the water, trapped in the sediment, and buried underground. Some of the biota that you're going to find in swamps is really going to depend on what kind of swamp it is. But for instance, if you go down to the swamps in Florida, you're going to find things like alligators, flamingos, beavers, stuff like that. These are water-tolerant animals because, again, this is covered in water all year long. So all those swamps are very nutrient-rich ecosystems. The soil is also very oxygen-lacking. However, many plants have been able to overcome this through adaptations through the root system. Mangroves, for example, have come up with two distinct types of root systems that are able to get oxygen from the air above the water. For example, the type over here is called a stilt root, and this kind of holds the tree above the level of the water. And this allows the tree to just gather oxygen from above the water surface. The other type is called the pneumatophore. And this, the roots begin underground, but then it begins shooting spikes up towards the surface, and they eventually grow until they break the water surface. This also allows the tree to get oxygen from the outside air. Some of the other biota that occupy swamps, they're going to be semi-aquatic reptiles, birds, and mammals.
We're interested in conservation because a lot of times bogs and swamps are destroyed because industry looks for peat. So peat is a non-renewable energy source that when dried out can be used as fuel. So that's why a lot of times swamps and bogs are destroyed by industry and by humans in general. And European nations seem to be a little more concerned about this than American organizations. So specifically there's a place called the IPCC, which is the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, that's working pretty tirelessly to make sure that the bog history of Ireland, which is apparently pretty important, is preserved. And they have like a 50-year plan set out to to raise funds through art sales and things of that nature so that they can buy back the bogs and swamps from the industries and the companies that are buying the land for the peat. And their plan is to buy them back, to maintain them, and to educate the public on what bogs do for us, what swamps do for us, because that's not always clear. I think John can kind of tell us a little about what swamps and bogs do for us. Why do we care?
Swamps and bogs are also really useful because they are natural water filters. As runoff comes from upstream lakes and rivers, they're going to pass through these swamps and bogs, which are going to, the plants trap these nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus in their plants. Also, all that nutrients that's not uptaken by plants is going to be like kind of conserved in the water and then buried underneath all that sediment. So, other than that, they're also kind of like a barrier against storm surges. For example, Katrina, back in 2006, that hurricane came through and wiped out pretty much the entire state of Louisiana simply because they didn't have a barrier to protect them against that. A swamp is kind of like a giant sponge, and as water levels rise, that sponge is going to soak up the majority of that water and really moderate all that flooding. So that's one reason we need to protect them. Another reason is because they're actually a source of fossil fuels. With this low oxygen level, as organisms die, they kind of get trapped under the water, and then they don't decompose. Instead, they just kind of get buried under layers and layers of organic material, and this carbon is eventually saved up and compressed into fossil fuels. So there's some other reasons that we need to save these ecosystems.